Well, it is an honor and a pleasure to be back home. I taught in this room in 1999, and it fits like a glove. So I've been at the Behavior Analyst Certification Board for 4 years now, 4 years last week. That was my anniversary. And the board, like the profession of applied behavior analysis, has been growing very, very rapidly. And on most measures, we're actually growing exponentially. And I'll show some of those data today. So what I hope to accomplish is to illustrate with some tangible evidence, some excitement about where we are professionally, and some inducement about how much work there is left to do, and that there are some infrastructures in the profession for doing what we need to accomplish to emerge out of the adolescence of the development of our profession into a mature adulthood, and to try to get you interested to help, because we have a lot to do and we have no time at all to waste. So the BACB was founded in 1998 in the state of Florida. It's a nonprofit corporation, and it was founded because state governments in the U.S. needed a way to identify individuals who had some defined training in behavior analysis. And outside of the Florida system that existed at the time, and a handful of states that had used Florida's examination for their own certification purposes, there really wasn't anything else. And so, hey Rick, the BACB was kind of created because there wasn't licensure for behavior analysts. And so it kind of functions in a similar manner, but from the profession instead of written into state statute. So we are in our 17th year of operation and our 16th year of actually certifying individuals. And our two certification programs, BCBA and BCABA, are master's and bachelor's level credentials. They're accredited by this organization, the National Commission for Certifying Agencies. And NCCA is kind of like the BACB for certification bodies. So we have to meet their standards, and basically everything about the way we operate and how we develop standards and change them over time is governed by this organization, and its basis is essentially federal anti-trust legislation, employment law, and what we know from psychometrics and professional testing. Now, this is Dr. Jerry Shook. Most of you don't know Jerry and probably never saw him. He was an alumnus of the university. In 2006, when I was still here, we voted to give Jerry the Distinguished Alumnus Award. So he was the 2006 winner of that award. And in the spring of 2007, he came here and received his award and gave an address. And his address was what I'm giving you today. Now, I actually have Jerry's files at the BACB, so I found his presentation. And so I know exactly what he reported at that time, just 8.5 years ago. So periodically, I'll refer back to the state of things when Jerry was here before. So you'll have some metric of growth between 2 points in time. So here's one of those. This is our organizational chart at the BACB. So we have 24 full-time employees. When Jerry was here 8.5 years ago, there were 2 employees at the BACB, and when I was hired 4 years ago, I was number 6. So we have grown so quickly because the field is growing quickly, and we need to have infrastructure in place to deal with that and support it. We're also adding 4 more in early spring. So we're rapidly outgrowing our space and developing new systems, and these are problems, but they're really wonderful problems to have. We are governed by a board of directors. And we have 11 directors right now. These are generally elected by the profession. So if you're certified by us in early spring each year, there's an opportunity to nominate individuals and to vote in the actual election. But you just kind of take a look at the board of directors. This is usually a who's who in behavior analysis, and that's certainly the case right now. And of all the organizations I work with, all the governing bodies, this by far is the group that gets the most done, is the most efficient, and is just the nicest to work with. And so they're real privileged to work with them. And disclaimer, this collectively is my boss. So 2/11 of my boss is here in the front row, but this is actually how I feel. All right, let's get to the data. So historically, our primary credentials were the BCBA at the master's level and the BCABA at the bachelor's level. For individuals who have the BCBA credential and a certain kind of doctoral degree, they can apply to get the doctoral designation, but it's not really a different credential. And then a little over a year and a half ago, we started the RBT credential to have some sort of credential for frontline technicians. So this graph here shows the overall number of BCBAs per calendar year. The data are roughly cumulative, but they're not actually cumulative because we don't change the data point for a specific year if someone is no longer certified. So this represents where we were at the end of each year. 2015 is incomplete. We just finished the final testing window in November. And right now in our offices, we have a work group doing the post-exam review, and test scores will go out in a week or two. So we will complete the data point there. But this is an exponential curve, the last half decade. And I think that we feel this in the profession, certainly if you go to conferences and think about the fact that you're now paid for your work, and that's actually a relatively new phenomenon, at least reliably so. It's pretty exciting, and so the data certainly bear that out. So right now, we actually have a little over 18,500 BCBAs worldwide, and you can certainly see where we were before. When Jerry was here before, we were almost to 4,000. So a lot of growth recently, to the point where it's almost impossible to make projections because the assumptions are unknown given the rapidity of growth. I mean, you don't want to make an exponential prediction. That's probably not realistic, but it's kind of hard to know where the curve's going to bend. Now, these are similar data. These represent the number of new BCBAs per year, and these are not cumulative, and it's the same curve. So quite a bit. Now what we are seeing here, which is interesting, we've seen it before, this data point here represents 2015, so we'll be adding the results of the November window to that pretty soon. So we're projecting really right about the same number this year that we had last year new. And it may be indicative of some sort of early stabilization, but as you can see, we've been there before, where we had a couple of data points in the row and then it took off again. And based on what we're seeing around the world, other countries coming online and the growth of new university training programs and the expansion of capacity in existing programs, I think it's unreasonable to think that we're entering a steady state. Here are the data for the BCABA credential. This is our bachelor's level credential, and there generally aren't that many of these because they're often not recognized in many areas, and there aren't funding streams set up to reimburse them for their services. But in terms of the overall number of BCABAs per year, and we're currently at 2,370 worldwide, you can see that we still are seeing growth there. And by the way, about a third of these folks at any given time upgrade to the BCBA credential, which I think is not surprising. And here are their year-by-year data. A lot of variability because we're looking at lower numbers, but still, in general, some evidence of increasing trends. But in total, right now around the world, we have just under 21,000 certificates. So this is a lot, right? In the United States, there are 240,000 certified occupational therapists. There are 100,000 certified speech-language pathologists and about 150,000 licensed psychologists. So these are impressive numbers, and we're happy to be there, and we're excited by what these data represent for the growth of behavior analysis. But we're nowhere near the steady state, and at some point we will be looking at 6 digits for behavior analyst practitioners within the United States alone. And it's something that I think is a little unnerving to a lot of behavior analysts to think about that volume. But if we're going to play on parity with these other professions, our carrying capacity in the US is probably in the low 6 digits. And as we expand our practice areas and develop workforces in different areas of emphasis, I think we're going to reach that even sooner than expected. We've run some projections. It's really, like I mentioned, it's difficult to know what even is a conservative projection based on some of the trends that we've seen. But I think within the next decade or so, we're probably going to be looking at 75,000 certified behavior analysts around the world. Again, that's a large number. It's not close to what some of the other professions are just in the United States. Now, we started this registered behavior technician credential a couple of years ago because we found ourselves in a position where we had credentials for everyone in the tiered service system except the individuals who actually work with the clients. And health plans were very persistent in their request for some way to identify and credential these individuals. So we published the standards. We started taking applications at the end of July 14. So these data are actually cumulative, and what we're looking at is month-by-month growth. And so in just a little over than a year, we're at 7,600. Now, these data were pulled on Friday, and I just called the office about an hour ago, and we're over 8,100 now. So and for the most part, these folks represent the early adopters. Because when individuals started being registered last year, in general, there weren't a lot of funding requirements, but agencies were preparing for the impending requirements that their workers be credentialed at this level. So again, we're kind of approaching an exponential function here, at least cumulatively, and we're still really just dealing with the early adopters. And if we assume that the kind of stable state of the number of technicians is some kind of multiplier against the number of behavior analysts, who are the supervisors, well, we have 21,000 behavior analysts worldwide, and if on average, each behavior analyst is paired with, let's just say, 2 or 3 technicians. Now, a lot of us don't have technicians, but those who do have way more than 2 or 3, then we should be looking at around 50 or 60,000 technicians. And based on where we're at, our projections for next year, our bands go from 25,000 to over 50,000 behavior technicians. So we're working very hard on these systems, and the mantra in our office is it scalable? If the way we're doing something and for the RBT credential is not scalable to 6 digits, then we can't do it that way. Now, here are your data in Michigan. So you have 357 certificates at the bachelor's or above levels, which is, it's a little low for Michigan given what Michigan has given the profession over the years. However, if we just go back 3 years, this is where you were just under 3 years ago, 133. So we've got a 160% increase in just under 3 years. So that's pretty tremendous growth. Other states that I think had more carrying capacity early on, and like more funding streams and recognition systems, they're looking at growth between 20 and 60% per year. And so clearly we're making up for lost time here with this growth, and this is very exciting. So we have a system known as the Approved Course Sequence System. And when this was developed a little about 15 years ago, it was developed as a paperwork reduction function. So the notion was, well, we keep getting applicants from Western, and we know what Western teaches, and we keep approving them, but our staff have to review each application. And at the time, Jerry was the staff, and Jerry was unpaid for the first 2 years of his work at the BACB. So the notion was, can't we simply simplify the process for applicants from known entities and not require them to send us the syllabi every single time and CVs? So we created the Approved Course Sequence System, which unfortunately has, I think, been misunderstood as a university program accreditation system. So ABAI runs our profession's accreditation system, and for that, they evaluate every aspect of a program, and if the program passes muster, they issue a seal of approval. This is not a seal of approval. This is, yeah, they teach what we require. That's all this is. What we look at is syllabi, and if the syllabi indicates that our coursework requirements are met at a university, and if the faculty CVs indicate that they meet our minimum standards for instructors, then we approve that course sequence. So please help me spread the word and clarify that this is not the same as program accreditation. I would encourage every program to become accredited by ABAI, because this is just a signal that your graduates are going to have a little bit easier time in their application process. But given that, it does serve an interesting secondary function, because it's an identifier for every action shot I get from a presentation, it's like, and so I told her to let me know, and then I'll just pause for a couple of seconds. What this does do is if a university has an approved course sequence, then what we know is there is some organized behavioral curriculum at that university. We don't know much about the quality or the depth or the breadth of it, but we know that it's there. So it is a useful metric in that regard. And so right now we have 289 institutions around the world with at least one approved course sequence. Some universities like Western have two, BCBA and BCABA. But here we're just looking at institutions, and I'll talk about the rest of the world a little bit later. If we zoom in and just look at the US, here's the distribution of training options in the US. And so when I was, I guess in '91, I was looking for graduate schools in behavior analysis, the number was much, much lower than where it is today. Now the BACB is located in Denver, right here in the middle of Mountain Station. As you can see, we have one program in town, but it's a distance program, so we don't really have anything on the ground in Colorado, and there's nothing within a 500-mile radius of the BACB. So we're doing what we can to meet with faculty at different universities just to let them know that we're there for support. But it turns out that the distribution of course sequences in the US closely tracks the distribution of the population in the US. So we don't have many training options in the Mountain States, but we also don't have many people in the Mountain States. And here are your data. So 8 for Michigan, which is actually a pretty good number. I'll refrain from making any opinionated statements about these 8. But there are some fine programs in the state, obviously. So the board of directors met, I guess, almost 2 years ago in Denver. And we actually worked with Dr. Peter Doms, who's a graduate of the department and really a spectacular strategic planner. And he worked with us for 2 days to perform a strategic plan for the BACB. And unlike most other strategic planning activities I've been involved in, this was really functional and useful, and a lot of good came out of it. And one of the things that came out of it was that we revised our mission and our vision statements. And we didn't fundamentally change them, but I think we clarified them in important ways. And what I've highlighted here is we've really hardwired international development into the mission and into the vision of the BACB. So the mission is kind of where we're heading, right? So what we do is we do consumer protection by issuing minimal level entry standards, but we do that worldwide. And our vision is to help save the world with behavior analysis. So no surprise there. But the statements were retitled. So now we have a global mission and a global vision. And that really, I think, highlights where a lot of our resources are going and a lot of our efforts and attention at the moment. Related to that, we changed our bylaws. So now we actually have 2 directors that must be non-US citizens who work outside of the US to make sure that because we are an international certification body, that we don't become too US-centric. And it's very easy to be US-centric when you're a US citizen and you're working in the US. And so this is probably ultimately not sufficient. I suspect that as we keep growing internationally, that we'll have a 3rd international director and a 4th international director. But right now we're lucky because Christos is a Greek behavior analyst who works in the UK, and Javier is a Spanish behavior analyst who works in New Zealand. So we have a lot of coverage with these 2 directors. And again, this is the organization, this is my boss, so this is the organization that sets the mission and the vision and authorizes all sort of critical activity. My job is just the implementer. So this bar graph here, it's a stacked bar. We have BCBA data in the Navy and the lighter blue is BCABA. This represents the overall number of certificates outside of the United States over the years. And again, we're looking at 1713, which compared to 21,000, of which this is a part, maybe isn't as exciting, but trust me, 1,700 credentialed behavior analysts outside the US, this is a big deal. I mean, this is where we were within the US just a little over a decade ago. And you can see the slope, and it's the same slope we're seeing in all of the other growth patterns. And based on what we know about what's happening in other countries right now, we're going to continue to see additional growth, and we're developing systems to support that. So this map illustrates the locations of our folks. So we have certificates in 67 countries, and the blue dots represent countries where we have 31 or more behavior analysts, red 11 to 30, and pink 1 to 10. So you can see most countries we have just a few certified behavior analysts, but we have a lot of concentration: Canada, Ireland, Israel, the UK, good parts of Europe, and Asia starting to come online as well. But these pink dots are interesting because these represent 1 to 10 certified behavior analysts, and these are the pioneers in these countries. And I've had the opportunity to meet some of these individuals, and in many cases, these are the folks that in 40 years, when the book chapter on the history of behavior analysis in X country is written, like they're the first few pages. And so it's really interesting to see. So even though we see small numbers, there's actually a lot of growth, a lot of activity. Now this shows that our course sequences outside of the US are housed in 71 universities in 34 different countries. And this is a much more important map than this map because the institutions map shows where the engines are that will make future behavior analysts. And so whenever a red dot hits the map, that's a real celebration in the office. I've deleted the US from this map because in Canada, 80% of the population lives within 50 miles of our border. And so because of that, if the US has a lot of activity on a given measure, you can't see the activity in Canada, which predictably is right along the US border. Something else I want to point out, we actually have a course sequence in Africa now. It's in Nigeria, and it's actually run out of a training clinic because we have to take a shaping approach to new training systems in other countries. And we've had instructors there teaching behavior analysis over the last few years against the backdrop of Ebola. This was ground zero for the Ebola outbreak and Boko Haram. That's all happening in Nigeria. So the next time you hear students or faculty complaining about something in the program, just remember our colleagues and what they're doing around the world to teach behavior analysis. So a lot of growth here. We're very excited about that. Kind of part of this is we do a lot of consultation and presentations around the world to really kind of assist our colleagues in thinking through infrastructure development courses. We do a lot of meetings with governments to talk about the importance of behavior analysis and funding it and recognizing it and credentials and that sort of thing. But just under a year ago, I hired a full-time doctoral level behavior analyst, our international development officer, Dr. Neil Martin. He works out of London, and so he actually does the majority of this. I actually only gave 2 of these presentations in the last year, and he says hello today from Rio, where he is meeting with some university faculty. I think one of the main things we're doing to assist in having a credential available in other countries is we've translated our examinations into different languages. A lot of resources around this, but it's important work because if you don't read English, then not only do you not have access to the majority of the literature, but you have really no way to become credentialed by the BACB. And I can tell you the resources required to operate, to set up and operate a legally defensible, legitimate certifying entity are prohibitive for most locations. And I mean, it took a long time for behavior analysis to get there in the US, and we've had resources for quite some time. So you can see the available indicates these tests are already available. Interestingly, we were in Beijing meeting with some of the leaders in the government there, and we already had the BCABA exam available in Chinese, and we asked if they wanted the BCBA exam as well, and they said no. In China, in graduate school, English is a core competency, reading English. Now we're going to get around to doing it quite soon, but I thought that was interesting. So the goal here, our board of directors just in August at our annual meeting, they voted to authorize all of these translations, and then we're done. So we have to maintain these examinations. So let's say that we revise a test item and realize, you know what, it would be clear if we add these 3 words to the item. Well, now we have to translate that a dozen times and then reverse translate it just to be sure. So we have to maintain all of this as well. But if all goes as planned by 2020, professional behavior analysis examinations will be available to 85% of the world's readers. So that's the goal, and that's kind of where we're headed. And it is an interesting statistic we discovered recently. 95% of the world's certified behavior analysts are in the United States, but only 5% of the world's population is in the United States. So we have a perfect imbalance. And if we think about actually saving the world with behavior analysis, this ratio is going to have to come down quite a bit. So we're doing more and more in the area of global development. All right, now I'm going to talk about some of the other developments at the BACB. One of the architects of certification early on in the profession, and by the way, the BACB represents the 5th credentialing program in behavior analysis in its history. There were 4 earlier efforts that were failed or were upgraded. And so it took us a while to kind of sort this out, but Hemingway was one of the early architects, and he passed away a little over a decade ago. So each year we give an award to an individual who not just has done good things in behavior analysis, but through their efforts, they've helped develop infrastructure. And generally, their efforts have resulted in more access to care. So the architect of the Autism Speaks health plan reform movement, Laura Unum, she was the Hemingway Award winner in 2008. And in 2015, it's Dr. Sandy Harris, and she is the godmother of applied behavior analysis in New Jersey. And she developed an integrated training center and university program to teach ABA and autism that began in 1972. So she was there early, and her accumulated outcomes have been really impressive. The call for nominations for the next year's Hemingway Award will go out next week. So please think about individuals in the field who've really done a lot to increase access to care. We routinely get asked at the BACB for data to assist in different initiatives. And often we're asked for data to indicate the growth of the profession, so that, let's say, a university administrator or an agency director will allocate more personnel resources in behavior analysis. And we've got great supply side data. So we can show you all sorts of curves on the growth of certified behavior analysts. But we didn't have any real demand side data. So we contracted with an organization called Burning Glass, and they work with the US Department of Labor and Statistics to actually create a demand side analysis for the workforce in the United States. And so we just finalized the report. We published it or announced it on our recent newsletter, and it's available on our website just as a free resource. So if there's anyone that you need to convince that people are looking for behavior analysts to hire, this is a very nice, succinct report towards that end. And here's just one example of one of the figures in here. This red data path indicates all of the job ads in this mega database for a 3-year period that required a BCBA credential or preferred a BCBA credential. Of course, the trends are going the same direction as everything else. So now we have some supply side data, some demand side data. This is just a resource for the profession. Well, as BAM and some of you know about licensure in Michigan and some of the thoughts around that, licensure of behavior analysts has been a real hot topic in the last half decade or so. If you're not familiar with this, so licensure basically is the product of a state law that says to do the work of this profession, you must have this credential issued by the state. And if you don't have this credential And unless you're otherwise exempt from the law, then you're practicing the profession without a license. So this is the kind of thing that Jerry Shook knew we were heading for, and it really was a goal early on. He said that his preference was, let's stay under the radar as long as possible till we have like 30,000 certified behavior analysts, some muscle, some money, and then we'll go for it, because licensure work is very difficult, and in some states it costs hundreds of thousands of dollars in lobbying fees to get it done. Well, several variables resulted in kind of premature pulling of the trigger for licensure, so we're well down the path, but right now there are 24 US states that have passed laws that regulate the practice of behavior analysis through licensure. Ohio technically does it through certification, but it's the same kind of licensure system. So it's coming to a state near you. And what's interesting about this is the first state to turn blue was Oklahoma, and it was in the first week of May in 2009. So we're just looking at 6.5 years worth of legislation being passed here, and we have half the country colored blue. A lot of other activity occurring as well. We currently have 3 states with active bills: North Carolina, which is really important because you cannot practice behavior analysis in North Carolina unless you are supervised by a licensed psychologist. It's the most restrictive right to practice state in the profession. This bill would undo that relationship. California, 3,500 behavior analysts in California, and 35 million people in the state. Very complicated landscape there. And Minnesota has a bill pre-filed. These states tried it last year, didn't work out. Michigan is going to be gearing up to introduce something very soon. And we've had some other states study this and fight off attacks after licensure was written into legislation. So we're very soon we'll have the majority of states with licensure. And there are lots of pros and cons to the issue, but the truth is that analysis is behind us. It's irrelevant. It's coming. And right now, I think one of the primary reasons to pursue it is that there are other professions that have an interest in licensing behavior analysts. And if we're licensed by another profession, our eligibility standards are going to look very different than they do right now with the BACB's credentials. And as an example, before Massachusetts had licensure, the Mass Psych Association wrote a bill and got it introduced. The psychologists were going to regulate behavior analysis, and the requirement was that all 1,000 behavior analysts in Massachusetts would have to be supervised by a licensed psychologist. Now the math on that falls apart very quickly. And the behavior analysts were able to introduce a competing bill, and it all worked out. But this is complicated work. It is critically important to get right, because when it's not right, it's the law. And then the only fix for a bad law is an amendment, which is the exact same process for passing the initial law. So from what I've seen so far at BAM and the Michigan community, your bill looks really good, looks clean, and it seems like the necessary muscle exists here to kind of shepherd the bill through the process. Still may not pass, but I think you got a good shot, and all the right variables seem to be in play. Now, the reason that we're involved in all of this is these almost all start from the professional association within a state. So we're actually not permitted to introduce and kind of lobby for legislation. What we do is, because most of these bills are based on our standards, we have to provide a lot of education to the stakeholders involved. So normally we do a little light consulting on the front end, and then we get pulled in for a lot of education throughout the process. But almost all of this activity is the result of the effort of the behavior analysis associations in those states. Well, another development is that we revised our ethics code. For the longest time, we had 2 critical ethics documents. We had a set of conduct guidelines, which was functionally the ethics code, but they weren't mandatory. And then we had a set of more abbreviated disciplinary standards, and those were the actionable standards. Well, we've combined those together into a new document. We've also done some slight expansions and a good deal of, I think, very helpful revision. Our new ethics code is called the Professional and Ethical Compliance Code for Behavior Analysts, and it goes live in 3 weeks. So after January 1st, any disciplinary complaint that we receive, and we receive about 100 per year right now, will be applied against this code. So violations of this document will be the trigger for future disciplinary action. So you want to make sure that you and everyone in your shop is familiar with the new code and the new disciplinary system. We also issued in 2012 some practice guidelines. This is the sort of thing that typically is produced by a professional association. And at some point, probably should be issued by ABAI or APBA, maybe some other national group. But there were so many laws being passed mandating that health plans cover ABA treatment for autism that the health plans were, once the smoke had cleared from the battle, they were perplexed because the structure of ABA treatment looks nothing like they've ever seen. You've got tiered systems, you have dozens of people involved, you have teams as the sort of unit of provider. In some cases, it's very intensive, a lot of expertise involved. And as a profession, we didn't have a document that said, here's the consensus on what this generally looks like in the profession. But what we learned was that there were several consortia of health plans that were getting ready to develop their own practice guidelines. And at least two of those, of which we were aware, had no behavior analysts on the commission. So what we were worried would be that maybe like the National Blue Cross Association would write sort of like the definitive document saying, here's what ABA treatment of autism spectrum disorders looks like, and that they would get it wrong. But once it was out there, then that would be sort of the definitive guide for what the treatment should look like and thus how it should be reimbursed. So another Western alum who was the president of the board at the time, Dr. Jane Howard, she convened a very extensive process that resulted in our 2012 practice guidelines. Last summer, the two of us oversaw a revision work group. And so just about a year ago, we published this document. Again, it's just a free resource for the website, and it's what you can use to communicate with individuals who you need, where you need them to know what the treatment should look like and kind of what the generally accepted practice is. And we made some nice revisions, and I'm hoping that the third edition of this will be picked up by a professional association, because again, this is a professional association activity, but we did it because it was just needed at the time. Well, we also started a philanthropy program that was modeled on the small grant program operated by SAAB, which is the group that publishes JABA and JAB. And so what we do each year is we make a small pool of money available for grants that have an opportunity to result in a product that will benefit our certificates. And the first grant, we've given two for this project, was to the Skinner Foundation when we realized that quite a few of Skinner's important works were just not available electronically. They were only available in book form. And so our collaboration with them through the grant, 4 of these are now available for under $9 or under $10. And it probably doesn't seem that important to the youngsters. But I think that being able to purchase verbal behavior on your phone in under a minute is like a miracle, right? And so the behavior of organisms, which will primarily be used for reference purposes, that'll be out soon, and this will kind of terminate this project. And for those of you who haven't read, I'm sure you've read verbal behavior or studied it with a sort of biblical attention to detail. And schedules of reinforcement, it's not a reader, a reference text perhaps, but cumulative record and continuous seizure reinforcement are collected works of Skinner, and basically they sort of represent Science and Human Behavior Part 2 and 3. And these two collections really do sort of extend and represent his expansions on the tenets of radical behaviorism, and they're fantastic, and you can have them on your phone in a minute. We also gave a startup grant to Autism Speaks Legal Resource Center. So I mentioned earlier that Laura Unum, she's an attorney, and she heads up their state government affairs initiative. So she has a team of 7 professionals who go across the country to work with groups in each state to get laws passed that require health plans to pay for autism treatment. Their threshold or their criterion for an endorsable bill is that ABA is covered. So that's what they're looking for. And through their efforts, they've passed these laws in 43 states. DC, U.S. Virgin Islands, and so they're almost done. Now, the last 7 states are going to be impossible. All the low-hanging fruit has been plucked, but it's really it's a striking effort, and it all began under a decade ago. So, I mean, we just haven't seen landscapes altered like this in the profession's history so quickly. But what a lot of people don't realize is even after you pass a law mandating health plan coverage of autism treatment, there's a lot of non-compliance by health plans, a lot of confusion, and a lot of times corrective action and sometimes legal action needs to happen to enforce compliance with the original law. So they actually set up a separate unit, a follow-up unit, and that's the Legal Resource Center, and it's actually run by Lori's husband, Dan Unum. And Dan is a super sharp attorney, so he's the one who comes to states. He's the muscle. But what they're also working on is Medicaid, because last year the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services, CMS, they issued a report to states, and they said, just remember, every Medicaid system should have an autism benefit under our early identification and treatment system. So they left it to each of the 50 Medicaid systems to sort of define what their autism benefit would be. Some of them will look okay, some of them are just atrocious. So Dan at the LRC is working with Dr. Gina Green from APBA to try, they've created kind of model benefit plans, and they're trying to fix things. And so if you're in a state and your Medicaid rates are, like $16 an hour for ABA treatment, which includes the technician and the BCBA, if that's what the rate is, Dan is going to be your resource. So we were proud to give him a startup grant for all that he does for the profession. Now, if you're teaching BCABAs, or you are a BCABA, or you supervise a BCABA, this is critically important. So through the kind of the normal standards or normal processes that we go through to revise our requirements, it was time to take a look at BCABA supervision. When this credential was launched in 98 and 99, there was no supervision requirement. So we had essentially an independent practice credential and behavior analysis at the bachelor's level. Now, the language on the BACB website at the time was, we strongly encourage supervision, but it was nothing more than a strong encouragement. And in 2009, the current requirement began, and that was 1 hour per month of supervision. Now, there's a lot wrong with that. 1 hour per month of a full caseload is probably insufficient, but that's the requirement. And also, if you decide to take 2 months off from practice, you still owe 1 hour per month, because it's a fixed requirement. It's not tied to any specific amount of practice. So we convened a work group in Denver. We revised the standards. We published them in a newsletter. We gave the field a 25-month heads up, this is happening. So we're about a year away from the launch, but I just wanted to briefly share these with you. We now require a written contract between the BCABA and his or her supervisor. Right now the language is should, which feels strong to me. Now the language is must. So you got to have a contract. And I think this is the most important criterion or requirement. The supervisor is now responsible for the work of the assistants he or she is supervising. Right now, that's not a requirement. And when we talk to stakeholders like state legislators and leaders of some of the health plan benefit packages, they ask us, they say, so the BCABA is supervised, right? And we say yes. And what they're hearing is, what they're really saying is, so the BCBA is responsible for the work, right? Because supervision in other professions means the supervisor is responsible for everyone in that cone of influence. And that was not clear in this instance, but now it is. And I think they're the right direction. We're also going to be listing the supervisor's name along with the BCABA in the certificate registry as an accountability measure. And we're now basing the amount of supervision on the amount of practice. So if an individual wants to take 6 months off to start a family or deal with a medical emergency or some other life event, then no supervision is required, because 0% of 0 hours is, or 2% of 0 hours is still 0. And brand new BCABAs will be more heavily supervised for their first 1,000 hours of practice. Probably the right call there as well. All of this goes live January 1st, 2017. And if you've been with us for a while, you know that we've been steadily ratcheting up our standards. And we've actually been doing it as quickly as is professionally responsible. This was a system, it's actually a system that every profession has used in the early days. And that is, you have to start the initial standards lower than you're comfortable with, because if you start them at, you got to have a PhD from Western, then you got 400 people certified and the program dies, and then someone else is going to come up with a way to identify behavior analysts. But then what you do is you slowly use a very careful, mandated, and legally defensible system for reviewing and revising standards in an upward manner. We've been doing this for the last 17 years. We are starting, I think, to enter the steady state on some of these, where the standards are more or less kind of what they're going to be, for some period of time. We know we're at the end of the steady state when the board of directors authorizes me to study something like the BCBA's degree requirement. And the work group I put together comes back and says it's fine. And the board says it's fine. And then 5 more years when we do this, the work group says it's still fine, and the board says, okay, we're good. That's pretty much when we're going to be in the steady state. So we have to wait until the process that results in the changes stops recommending changes. And so we don't know if we're there yet, but I feel like this is it, or we're real close to it for BCABA. Now, if you're certified, this is the most important slide in the entire presentation. We're making some changes to the length of our certification cycle, and we're making some changes to, or have made changes to CEU requirements. So we have an inactive status available. So starting last November, if you need to take some time off and you're not going to practice, you can check in with us and apply to go inactive, and we put pause on your certification cycle, and we unpause it when you come back. Now, you can't practice during that interim period, but we allow you to essentially pause that. But with that comes along a responsibility, I think a more dire responsibility to maintain your active certification status. So we now have a 90-day deadline. If you let your credential expire, you have 90 days to make it right. And after that 90-day period, you are no longer certified. If you wish to become certified, you must apply under the standards at that time. Now, I don't meet certification standards today under the coursework option. I met them in 2001 when I was certified, but I don't meet them now, so I maintain my credential like crazy. Let me explain why this is important. For many years, we had a reentry policy where you would contact the BACB and we'd work with you and you'd do some CEUs, pay a little fee, and we'd let you back in because you're a good person and we want your career to be unaffected. Well, for the longest time, we wanted to be on the radar, right? We wanted people to seek our services. We wanted reimbursement for those services. Well, we're on the radar now, but being on the radar means that we're now interacting with some really serious people and some serious stakeholders, and that kind of reentry system just doesn't work anymore. So this is what happens. Probably on a weekly basis, we get 2 or 3 phone calls in the office, and they're a little sinister in their specificity. And the phone call goes something like this. Hi, can you tell us if Stephanie Peterson was an active BCBA certificate on March 13 of 2015? So the specificity is what's kind of creepy. So clearly what happened was Stephanie billed something at that point in time, but the health plan now has reason to believe that maybe she wasn't certified. Well, what if Stephanie had let her credential lapse 2 months earlier? And then later on, because she knows Jim and she's my boss, I let her back in. Well, what's the answer to the question? Was she certified on March 13th? No, technically she wasn't. She let her credential expire. So what's the answer we give to the health plan? Well, the answer has to be, well, actually, she had expired her credential. We let her back in later. But for this period of time, she did not have an active credential with us. So now she's guilty of billing fraud. And that is a very real, tangible situation right now. So what we're trying to do is have a tight standard to motivate everyone to maintain your credential. And toward that end, we're changing over from a 3-year cycle to a 2-year cycle so it's easier to track. So if you're currently certified by the BACB and you haven't yet recertified this year, you're still on a 3-year cycle. But if you've already recertified on or after January 1st, anyone here in that boat? All right, so those of you with your hands up, you're in the right column. So you are now on a 2-year cycle. The rest of us, we're in the left column. We tried to figure out some way to wipe everyone's dates away and bring them all back, and we had 2 bad options. This is the lesser of the 2. So if you're in the 3-year cycle, you're still going to do annual renewal. So you renew, recertify. But as soon as you recertify, you're going to go into a 2-year cycle. And once you're in a 2-year cycle, there are no more annual renewals, which means there's only one check-in date with the BACB. It's every 2 years at the end of your cycle. Now, this date has become critically important. So you tattoo this date on your body in an unobtrusive location, put it in your reminder system, make sure that when that date comes around, you've got your CEUs and you're ready to recertify, because the alternative is much more effortful. If you're in a 3-year cycle, you're still going to get your 36 CEUs per 3 years. If you're a BCBA, or 24 at the BCABA level. If you are in a 2-year cycle, we've upped the annual amount up. So now it's 32 CEUs every 2 years, or 20 at the BCABA level. And we have some subcategory requirements that are a part of the total. So if you're still in the 3-year cycle, your requirement is 3 years in ethics/professional stuff. It's a broad category because when this requirement was instituted, there was virtually no content at our professional conferences on professional ethics. Every once in a while there'd be something on research ethics, but really nothing like what we see today. So as a result, the category is broad. So ethics and kind of professionalism and dealing with legislators and that sort of thing. Once you're in a 2-year cycle, the requirement is more narrow. It's 4 CEUs in ethics, period. And we're at a point now where that's not a challenge to achieve. And if you're supervising individuals in the BACB system, RBTs, BCABAs, students becoming certified, then you need 3 CEUs in supervision every 2-year period. And so this is a real opportunity for new content to be delivered and made available. And I'm hoping that the rapid expansion of content and ethics at our conferences will be paralleled by a rapid expansion and content on supervision at our conferences, because we need it and it's time. Okay, kind of wrapping up here. We're currently testing based on the 4th edition task list. We recently began developing the 5th edition task list, which started with a targeted survey of the EAB leadership and behavior analysis and the faculty. In November, we had a 16-member work group of experts in behavior analysis that we flew in from 6 different countries. They spent 3 days with us. They prepared a draft 5th edition task list. If you're certified by the BACB, you'll receive this task list in a survey in January, where you will give us ratings of the importance of items and the frequency of their appearance in your practice, and you will get 5 CEUs for a complete survey. In May, I'll be presenting the revised task list based on the survey to our board of directors. They will very likely approve it. Next fall, we will publish the 5th edition task list, along with any corresponding changes or increases in coursework requirements, and we will begin testing on the 5th edition task list in February 2021. So write that down, February 2020. I'm just kidding. It's a very long timeline, because if there are coursework changes, we have to give universities ample time to make those curriculum revisions. We finally updated and improved our website. We actually have another revised launch plan for late spring, which is going to be even better. But for now, our graphic designer recommended the BACB is at the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. The view out of our windows is very similar to these flat irons from Boulder. So they recommended that we incorporate the mountains into the website, because it conveys strength and beauty, and we're strong and beautiful. But here's the original image from which that was cropped. These are the foothills outside of Boulder. This is 45 minutes north of us. But right now, what we're feeling in Denver is this, the snow-covered mountains. So very soon, when you go to the BACB's website in the winter, you will be greeted by a snowy landing page. And then when things cheer up, we will be back to the beautiful sunny Rocky Mountains. So thank you very much for your attention today. Yeah, like where the steady state's going to be in a certain country.
Right. You mentioned it was kind of unnerving. So how often are you guys kind of revising that task list?
That's a good question.
For, incoming BCBAs to be, I guess, confident.
So the question here is, I mentioned that we sometimes lose sleep at night because of the rapid growth of the profession and how much we have to do just to keep up and maintain a credential around that rapid growth. I assume that Gina Green and Maria Malott also lose a lot of sleep at night in terms of their professional association and the wonderful challenges posed by the growth. So the question is, the second part was, in terms of standards development and revision, like how often do we review things? Well, NCCA, our accrediting body, requires us to review every substantial requirement every 5 to 7 years. And if more than that elapses before we've looked at a requirement, then our accreditation is jeopardized. So we generally have every standard on a 5 to 6 year plan. Actually, we're looking at RBT again in late spring because it's growing so quickly. So I put that on a 3.5 year timeline. And again, the process we use is we invite in a very carefully stratified group of behavior analysts who have a strong likelihood of making an informed decision about what it is we're studying. Again, we could be studying CEU requirements, supervision requirements, degree. Our exam is always under continuous revision. And then they spend several days with us. A lot of times we'll put together relevant research for them ahead of time. Sometimes we'll survey the field to get them the data they need for their deliberations. They'll spend 2 to 3 days on the issue. We use a consensus approach to get to a recommendation. I write up a report, I present it to the board of directors. Our board of directors is also a group of subject matter experts, and then they review, and then what the board gets to do is an up or down vote. The board cannot cherry pick or revise anything, because if they could, then why do we use the first work group, right? So it kind of hamstrings them a little bit, but I think they trust me to kind of implement things at the appropriate level. And if they vote it in, then our job is to announce it to the field and develop the systems to implement it. So on a regular basis, every standard gets thoroughly reviewed every 5 to 6 years. And as I mentioned earlier, I think we'll know when we hit the steady state, when we do a couple of those, and things don't really change that much. And it feels like we're there on the BCABA credential. Don't put that on Facebook, please. And I will be there for BCBA within the decade. I'm quite confident. By the way, the profession's rapidly growing. It's changing. It's very easy to get into kind of a generational bias sort of thing about young practitioners today. They're not like when we were kids. And trust me, when I was a kid, we're not very good practitioners. And we'd never taken an ethics course, and we didn't know what a CEU was. So things have changed, and I think objectively, for the most part, they've changed for the better. But I think there is some concern with rapid growth of the profession. At one point, you kind of knew everybody, and or there were maybe a couple of thousand folks in the country, and that kind of felt right. And you could actually meet people at ABA. You could be in the bar and see everyone you knew, and now you can see no one you know in the bar. And so things have changed, but keep in mind, if where we're headed is 100,000 certificates in the United States, well, let's say that it takes us 30,000 certificates to get to the steady state where we're requiring everything we're going to require, then that means that, in 20 years, when we're at 100,000, 30,000 of us would have come in under the old system. And some of us maybe were good, and maybe some of us were not so good. 70,000 will have come in under the steady state requirements. So I think if you take the long game, the long view, and kind of think about where we're really headed, I think that the time that we spent with lower standards going up to the steady state standards won't feel as substantial as it does to some people now. Yes?
So thinking about the long view, do you anticipate that in all of our lifetimes that master's level clinicians will continue to work independently?
Yeah, so the question is, will master's level behavior analysts remain independent in their practice? Absolutely. I can't imagine any force strong enough to change that. And I mean, we're having a hard enough time producing master's level practitioners. So we have 16,800 master's level behavior analysts in the world. Think of the doctoral level behavior analyst capacity we would need to supervise 16,800 master's level behavior analysts. Not going to happen. If it does, something bigger and more horrible has happened. But I think that's solid. And so we're going to end up being a profession where the core credential is at the master's level, which is really the modal situation for most of the helping professionals. In the back, yes.
What is the BCBA doing to foster research that people would be applied to?
Good question. What is the BACB doing to foster research that would maybe be of value to people in the applied setting? Nothing. We are a certification board. But again, as I mentioned earlier, we are one of the national or international bodies, and so I think a lot of times people look to us. We are an accredited certification body, and our job is to issue a credential. And from time to time, when we see that a professional association has not given us what we need in kind of a dire way right now, we'll sometimes step in. But when we do that, we've got to check with our legal counsel and our accrediting agency. Hey, is it cool if we issue practice guidelines on this right now? Can we do this? There's really no constellation of variables where we would be facilitating research in the profession. What I'm doing is I'm an editor, and I do a lot of editorial work, and I consult with a lot of researchers. And I will tell you this, if you're doing research in an area that could be of interest to practitioners, well, good for you. But I think that we have so few behavior analytic researchers who reliably contribute to the literature that I don't think we have any time for kind of pet interest research questions. Or I'm going to take some time and work on this, and I wish we did. I wish we had an army of researchers so that all the practical questions could be answered and all the sort of interesting side questions that might lead to something else interesting down the road could be answered, but we don't. So I encourage all of the researchers that work in an area that could be of an interest to practitioners to really think about honing their research questions, and think about presenting to a room of 100 practitioners. Would they care about your research question? And I can tell you, I've done some research where that was clearly not the case, and where it clearly was the case. And man, practitioners really value when you're answering their questions. So just something to think about. But no, the BACB can't really take a direct role there. Another question in the back?
Yeah, I just had a question about the master's degree requirement changes for
Yes.
the CPA exam. Could you explain the BACB's position on those changes?
Yeah, it's a good question. So remember, all of our standards get reviewed and revised over time. So the early requirement for the BCBA credential was a master's degree, period. And then, again, it doesn't come from BACB staff. Then a work group recommended it's time to start pulling in that any degree is fine requirement. And so we were left with psych, ed, most of the human, I think all the human services, medicine was in there, engineering was in there, which, trust me, has been a real political liability for us, because you can logically make the connection like, no, engineers are clear thinkers. So behavior analysis is a perfect combination with certain kinds of engineering. But that doesn't work across the table from a state legislator. It doesn't work at all. And it doesn't work when the head of the State Occupational Therapy Association is trying to diminish our profession through kind of like wacky face validity exercises. So they did pull back the degree requirement, and then a few years later we convened another work group. And what they recommended was that we required degrees in behavior analysis, education, psychology, or anything else as long as that graduate program had an approved course sequence embedded in the program of study. So there actually right now is a social work program, a master's in social work. And they're in the process of exploring how to hire 2 behavior analysts, faculty members, to teach within that master's program so they can embed an approved course sequence. We will accept those degrees because those degrees will be associated with a behavior analytic experience. Keep in mind the degree requirement currently is separate from the coursework requirement. So the degree requirement is just what kind of master's do you have. You still have to take all the courses to meet that requirement. So the original list of approved academic domains was this big. Now it became this big, and now it's this big. So it feels like we're heading in a direction. Now ultimately that direction will be governed by the work group that we convene in a few years and our board of directors who would vote in any recommendation. But it feels like where we're heading is a merger of our coursework requirement and our degree requirement, and at some point, probably in the near future, if you are a betting person, it would be reasonable to bet that the BCBA eligibility requirement will be a master's degree in behavior analysis. I don't know if that's going to happen. The process has to produce that outcome. but it feels like that's where we're headed with these changes. And if that is where we are, then we're on parity with every other profession. So if I wanted to be an SLP, there's no amount of coursework or experience I could put together with my degree from Florida State and be able to take the CCC exam. I would need a degree in that profession. So that's kind of how it happened and a possible future, but we really just have to wait and see. Dick?
Could you have a master's degree in behavior analysis? The BACB, the course sequence.
I'm sorry, could you?
Could you have a master's degree in behavior analysis from the BACB course sequence?
Like right now?
And like right now.
Yeah.
And a social work degree or especially.
Oh yeah, I mean, if
Have to be psychology.
yeah, so right now our degrees are, the degree has to be in behavior analysis, education, or psychology. The location of those units is irrelevant. Yeah. Anything else? All right, thanks guys, appreciate you coming out today.